right, we're here with David Princeton from Advocate Claim Services. And you're in Wisconsin. What's the city name again?
Sure. I'm located in Muskego, Wisconsin.
Muskego.
Muskego, Wisconsin. Relatively rural, but about 30 minutes outside of Milwaukee.
Milwaukee. Okay, very good. They're in the Midwest. And so, like we've been talking about, this is part of our 3 questions with the pro segment. All of us are kind of learning as we go as it relates to COVID-19 and trying to grab puzzle pieces from each other. And as we share them, hopefully we get a more robust, better, common sense approach to how we can help each other through this whole scenario. So before we get started, why don't you tell everyone a little bit about your background? I know you had said you've been in the insurance industry for about 15 years and quite a diverse experience as adjuster, a broker, and a buyer. Can you tell us a little bit about your background in insurance?
Sure. So graduated from college, applied to 72 different places, didn't get a call back, walked into a Progressive Insurance open house, was one of 2 people picked out of 300 to become a field rep. Lived inside of those little white trucks or the IRVs for about 100 hours a week. Did that for a couple of years. Anything they threw at me, I handled. Got into something called subrogation with Travelers Insurance.
Okay.
And did that for 7 years at the National Property Recovery Center for them. Got into developing different lines of recovery business. Essentially figuring out the way the world works, how the policies function, and then developing ways to maximize those dollars of recovery. Then from there, got into the broker world, worked for one of the top 50 brokers in the United States, was eventually promoted to their lead claim specialist. And in that role, I advocated on behalf of business customers or business clients with their insurance carriers to ultimately get something out of the policy, right? So whether that was to trigger a liability defense in those situations, or it was to get property coverage or first-party coverage in the event of a loss. So it was about the strategic presentation of claims. I left there about 2 years ago and got recruited by a private equity group. I've been their director of corporate risk for the last several years. And then my motivation to ultimately help small business with dealing with complicated insurance problems sparked me to start Advocate Claim Services last July. My business partner and I at the time, we really saw a need in the marketplace to help small businesses or any size business for that matter strategically navigate the complexities of insurance policies to be able to speak within the 4 corners of that page.
I always like to ask this question. I've only ever met one person on the insurance side that like grew up wanting to be in insurance and fully intended. Were you going to school for insurance, or is it more general biz, or?
Sure. So I majored in philosophy.
Okay.
Always had an interest in being a lawyer.
Okay.
And I'm actually living that part of my dream right now. I'm currently attending law school.
Wow.
While I do all these other things, sort of
While you
helping
launch a business?
While I launch a business, and while
Wow.
I'm also the director of corporate risk as well. So, I think I've been fortunate to be able to pursue my dream. It took me 3 years to get accepted to law school.
Wow.
And it was something that I really had to lean into and really embrace, and I've been loving every minute of it. Being able to speak to, so the part about insurance that really intrigued me, especially, philosophy major and whatnot, it's the power of words on paper.
Okay.
And really that language, right? The use of language, the use of punctuation, being able to navigate some of those nuances and move into the meaning of the words, right? To really help facilitate an understanding of what that policy is there to actually do.
Yeah, I think you shared your tagline is, "We don't sell insurance, we make it work."
Correct. Yes.
Yep. So, well, that's okay. So what we've been talking about is prior to COVID-19. It's interesting. So COVID-19 or a pandemic like this kind of exposes holes in the system or areas where we need to obviously be more resilient and develop. And in some cases, the economy has been great and things have been going along really well. And so sometimes that causes us to get a little bit lax in our approaches. What do you see even pre-COVID-19 as far as it relates to property restoration and insurance coverage? Some of those holes that or common areas where you've been able to bring some value into those conversations.
Sure. So good question, John. The way that I've sort of approached most of my um, uh, claim challenges, right? So a doubtful and disputed claim, which is going to be a
Yeah.
lot of what you're going to see with, especially with COVID. Usually what you have to look at from a coverage perspective is you got to understand what the business or what the homeowner is ultimately going through. So step one is you got to listen. You got to hear their whole story. You got to ask probative questions, and you really got to get to the heart of what's going on. The next part, and this is the part where I see the most common failures in the application of insurance, whether it be by an adjuster, by a broker, or by an insured. Hardly anybody takes the time to read an insurance policy, right? The insurance policies are very dynamically constructed contracts. They're formed through a three-party relationship. You have the insured, you have a broker, and you have the insurance underwriter or the insurance carrier's underwriter. That conversation, having been a buyer of insurance now, that conversation is extremely dynamic. Having been on the broker side, I used to think I understood the dynamics being on the broker side. Being
Yeah.
on the buyer side is even a little bit scarier, right? When you're sitting there and you're trying to have conversations about risk and profiles, you're covering the major bases, right? And a lot of times you're left with the strength of a broker to be able to foresee a lot of these shortfalls or these gaps that you're talking about.
Yeah.
And that's when you hope to get either, if there is no coverage available in the marketplace, you hope to at least end up with some really robust sublimit. And you hit on one of the biggest sublimited areas in the country, right, which is the mold part of a policy. Common failures that I see there actually come from mold remediation contractors or restoration companies. The estimatics procedures that are followed, if they're not writing their estimates narrowly so that the personal protective equipment, the drywall cleaning, or excuse me, drywall removal, isn't something that is already narrowly written to just the mold cost,
Yeah.
they're eating up a sublimit that is precious, because that might be the only money an insured has available to pay for that cleaning. Recently had a situation. So I mentioned I'm in Wisconsin. I'm actually licensed out of Texas. That Texas license gives me reciprocity in 30 states that require an adjuster to be licensed. The other states don't have those license requirements. So recently I was assisting a homeowner in Colorado, and they had a really interesting situation. So they had reached out to us because their mold limit was eaten up by an estimate by a remediation contractor. It became pretty quick just reviewing it that the contractor's estimatics wasn't the tightest, right? What you think would be common knowledge isn't necessarily common
Yeah.
knowledge.
Yep.
And so you have this estimate that needed to be cleaned up. So it was a matter of two simple conversations, and simple, I take that for granted, right? So, but two conversations to ultimately get the contractor to reconstruct their estimate, narrowly segment the costs that are directly associated with the mold remediation. So maybe a thicker mill bag, the PPE that an employee needed, the mold remediation testing to get the proper protocols, et cetera. And then we were able to take that estimate that was written well over the policy limits, got it within those sub-policy limits, and then the entire claim was covered by the insurance policy, less a deductible. So that homeowner went from facing a $15,000 out-of-pocket loss to actually having it all covered and just the deductible expectation. So
a win-win.
A win-win for everybody. I mean, and
Yeah.
the contractor got paid. That's probably the most important thing when I think of money that contractors have to leave on the table because an insured just simply doesn't have to have it, or they got to pay credit card fees in order to receive the payment.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, I think you and I talked about offline. I mean, my original introduction into the industry was in mold remediation, and at the time it was covered and things were going well. And then they started shrinking the coverages, and we had to learn very soon, especially when it's a water damage event that leads to microbial growth and those kinds of things, separating out. And so when you were initially bringing that up, I'm thinking this should be common knowledge for contractors, restoration contractors, but yet it's not. You got a lot of new people coming into the industry and a lot of people that maybe don't understand the nuances. And we're not, as property restoration contractors, we're not supposed to be policy experts, but understanding if there's a limit to coverage, separating out the scopes of work. So, setting up a containment, setting up a drying chamber, that should be water related. Removing the drywall that's wet is water related, not putting that under the mold specific, so.
And
that's,
what it can be too, John, is the integration of technology into these fields.
Yeah.
A lot of people take for granted, oh, I just point and click and then I have an estimate.
Yeah.
But if you don't code something correctly as you go along, and by code I don't mean software, by code I just mean properly tag it, right? In those software programs, you end up with an estimate that's not properly skewed.
Yeah.
Right?
Well, and in our realm, most common is Xactimate. So you got the WRT line items or the HMR line items, but then using your F9 notes to create, we always create a story of the loss, right? And that sounds like exactly what you tried to help the contractor do, is tell a better story or more, a fuller story, right? Rather than just a Cliff Notes version.
Correct.
And
keep in mind, adjusters should be writing their own sheets too.
Yeah.
And I think we all know how that goes a lot of times. So
So sometimes for better or for worse. So that's even pre-COVID-19, understanding, what you're dealing with and the language of this, it's interesting you brought that up, the story from the insurance perspective, whether that's a homeowner or a business owner, so that's obviously a part of the story. So now as we transition in, I think you and I were, in a LinkedIn conversation talking about, and I think the note you made, somebody was talking about there may be coverage under pollution liability, and you had said there has to be a trigger. And so that's what I guess where we want to bring in this part of the picture is, what are you learning on your end as far as claims language and coverage as it relates to COVID-19 responses, and some recommendations you can give both to restoration contractors responding and maybe businesses or homeowners that are impacted?
Yeah, so and maybe more specifically within the context of businesses. Right. Homeowners, I think, are going to have a difficult time. A lot of homeowners policies aren't going to carry a positive pollution language in it. That being said, I think one thing to always understand is that you got to read the policy, right? So listen and read. That's the two core values here at ACS, or Advocate Claim Services. You got to listen to the facts and the details, and you got to be able to read the policy and understand that policy. So moving into the pollution liability or a pollution policy. So pollution policies have been around for a very long time. The neat thing about a pollution policy is that they are typically very broadly written. A good rule of thumb when it comes to a pollution policy is that it looks to pay for the cleanup of something that shouldn't be there, right? So I commonly use this example because it's pretty relatable. When I put gasoline in my car, it's supposed to be in the gas tank. It's not a pollutant. If I spill gasoline on the ground, it's not supposed to be there. It needs to be cleaned up properly, right? So when you bring that into sort of this virus context or a COVID or really sort of any dynamic, you got to ask yourself sort of that first question of, well, is it supposed to be there, right? I think we would all say from a COVID perspective, no, it shouldn't be there, right? Yeah, no, thank you. Well, the next part though, and this is one of the challenges that I think you're going to see nationally, especially with the sort of the push of government agencies with the social distancing. unless you actually have a confirmed instance on your premises, it's going to be really difficult to find a way to trigger coverage,
Huh.
because much like my gasoline example, right? You don't, like, once it's out and it's there, you know that it's out and it's there.
Right.
Absent confirmation of a COVID-19 situation, you don't really know that you have a virus on premises.
Right.
You know, I think back to my claim handling days, or my advocacy days with a brokerage. There was a situation involving avian flu and
Yeah.
chickens, right? Um, there was some hesitation by the pollution carrier at the time, because we hadn't got the test results back, but yet the USDA is there telling us we need to kill an entire flock, right?
Huh.
So an entire hen house, right? So when you have those situations and you have those dynamics, once you get the trigger, right? So you get the confirmation of the test, then you have the order of the government to remove the hazard, right? Um, Now you're into that realm of coverage with it, or a coverage trigger within a pollution policy. And it also looks at first and third party damages, right? And so if you have a confirmation of an area that is impacted by COVID-19, and my mind immediately goes to sort of the senior living environment that
Yeah.
we've seen nationally.
Yeah.
You know, I have family members in a senior living environment. They are on absolute lockdown locally. I dropped off some groceries this morning. I had to leave them in the vestibule
Wow.
because they're not allowing people in, right?
Yeah.
Um,
Well,
which
one
is
of
great.
the
I applaud, right? Excuse me?
I was gonna say one of the primary ones that set this off was here in Washington State up north.
Yes. Yeah.
So yeah.
Yeah, and so this is actually a really good example of where I would anticipate coverage already existing within those dynamics. So senior living is already sort of a medical environment.
Right.
There's more than likely going to be some type of state or federal regulations that apply to that facility and how they're supposed to handle situations like this. And then there's going to be established procedures, right? So when I think of a duty to mitigate under a liability policy, hiring a restoration company to come in and clean, especially, I'll call it proactively, I think that's a really good opportunity to try to get a liability policy to pay for these proactive measures being taken, especially if you can show that, for example, let's say you had a common employee go from location A to location B. Well, now you have that opportunity for spread, right?
Yeah.
So if you have it at A, chances are you might be able to get coverage for not only A's cleanup, but B or C as you go through your multiple premises if you have cross-contamination or staff that travels between.
Huh.
That would probably be, I think, one of the, breaking my own rules, so to speak, about reading a policy and listening.
Yeah.
That'd be one of the things that I could foresee happening.
Now, so you talked about the pollution coverage, but also we're hearing a lot, and you mentioned I guess the civil authority, right? Like in the instance where they're ordering the execution of the flock of chickens, or we're seeing now, I believe the first lawsuit came out of New Orleans, right, where they're arguing basically civil authority and suing their insurance company. Do you know much more about that situation or have any comments on that?
Civil authority is going to be an uphill battle.
Yeah.
The the trouble you have is that typically the trigger for a civil authority is that there was some type of loss, meaning let's say a refinery explosion, right? And it's an active and ongoing fire, and then they close down by civil authority a 10-mile radius around the plant. When you start to look at insurance policies in that type of context, you had a covered event, right? So a fire or explosion at a dependent property or one in your area, and that event would then be covered under your policy. Thus, you get something called dependent property, or you get the government shutdown coverage, right? Because there was an otherwise covered event at someone else's premises that caused the government to shut down your area, right? So you have roughly about 4 different elements there that have to be met before that civil authority coverage is triggered.
Yeah.
One of the challenges with a civil authority, call it cause of loss, is that they're doing definitely mandates, but you don't necessarily have the trigger because you're not specifically being shut down by government, right?
Yeah.
It's general, it's broad, it's social distancing, it's I think of like restaurants and other things that are in my area and nationally where groups of 10 or less or takeout only, right? Or they'll do delivery. You're not getting into an area where I think that there's going to be an express trigger of coverage there.
Yeah.
I also think that what you're going to see in the forefront of insurance issues, especially with COVID, is you're going to see the full force of insurance companies ultimately resisting these claims. And the reason being is that if one gets through, many more can get through,
Yeah.
right?
Trickle effect. Yeah.
The trickle effect and the precedents. What I applaud about the Louisiana situation um, is, I'll call it the willingness of relatively a small business when you think about it, in the scale of companies going through tough times right now. A small business willing to put their nickel down and try to pursue it.
Well, and their
You know,
carrier is Lloyd's, right? So one of the
yep, Lloyd's.
larger. Yeah.
Yep. So Lloyd's Syndicate, right? So the oldest syndicate on the planet when it comes
Yeah.
to insurance, right?
Yeah.
Um, and that's probably part of the specialty nature of it. And I did see one comment, and this is I think an important point for a lot of people out there as they choose to present claims, is you got to be patient, right?
Yeah.
So one of the main things that I saw, sort of in a LinkedIn comment, and I wish I could remember the name so I could cite the source, but essentially that lawsuit could feel a little bit premature because it ultimately wasn't hashed out, if you will. The claim
Sure.
didn't get presented, and then a dialogue ensued to better understand the claim. We went right to a lawsuit. I understand the dynamics of both sides of that. It's just the challenge I think you have in the environment that we're in is the ability of an insurance company to respond in the context of a lawsuit is going to be much narrower than they could otherwise engage in conversation,
Yeah.
right? So one of the important things at Advocate Claim Services that we do is we're willing to engage in dialogue. We're not lawyers, right? But what we are is we're strategic presenters of claims. We're able to talk about those difficult and challenging situations to help carriers better understand that promise they made to that business and
Yeah.
help fulfill that promise. So it always comes back to sort of those core values. You got to listen and you got to read, right? And then ultimately with those adjusters, I mean, it's a lot of hearts and minds, right? And potentially uphill battles to help
Yeah.
an adjuster understand or help a manager understand.
Yeah. Well, David, you've given, uh, you've been very generous with your time and your area of expertise. And I mean, I know my head's reeling, and I'm sure people listening to this will spark a lot of thoughtful engagement. And this is obviously an area of specialty. Whether it's COVID-19, that part is evolving, but that claims advocacy, understanding the policy. I mean, those are just great points. Regardless, listen to the facts and details, and then read and understand the policy. I think that's the same thing for restorers, right? Which is a lot of the information coming out is knowing what your client needs, understanding the value that you can bring to the table, and making sure you both are clear about what is being offered and what the expected outcome is. Which is, I think, goes back to whether you're selling an insurance policy or any other cleaning service outside of COVID, and then obviously, definitely when it relates to something that's unfolding. So, any other closing comments or thoughts that you have on this topic?
Sure. I think two things. One, for a restoration company, be real careful about what you're promising you're able to do.
Yeah.
And not only what you expressly promise, not only what you expressly promise, but what you're implicitly promising.
Sure.
So warranty statements in your contracts would probably be a good thing to take a look at. Making sure that you have some type of waiver of implied warranty around the cleaning or remediation of something. My hope would be with the mold and other things that environmental remediation contractors get involved in, that a lot of those waivers and other things are there. If they have concerns about that, reach out to qualified legal counsel. to get that addressed. I think secondly, as things develop, one of the things that we do here at ACS is we actually offer at no cost to a bottom line, we will listen and we will read your policy, and then we'll give you a forecast of what it is that we think we could do to help you. So if people are interested in that, I would encourage them to go to my website, which is losspayee.com. So LOSSPAYEE.com. They can also call or text directly, 414-841-6462. That's 414-841-6462. Be more than happy to listen to anybody's situation, be more than happy to take a look at anybody's insurance policy and give them a forecast of what I think a carrier would do.
Well, that's, again, David, I can't thank you enough. I think we'll be in touch, hopefully in the future if you'll allow it. And good, congrats on starting the business, and good luck. And thank you for sharing your area of expertise with us.
Yeah, thank you, John. Appreciate the opportunity.
Yeah.
Romantic.